Having seen The Rise of Skywalker 3 times now, I'm finally beginning to realize how I truly feel about this film. As a hardcore Star Wars fan that has dedicated the last few years of my life to documenting the universe, keep in mind that these opinions do come from a hardcore fan. And I've been a fan of this franchise ever since I was a little kid, watching Return of the Jedi with my parents and grandparents, and being awed by the skills of Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, the Emperor, and more, and absolutely falling in love with all of the characters from the OT to the prequels, and now even the sequel trilogy. As a Star Wars fan, it's very clear after the events of The Last Jedi that there was a huge shift in the fan base, as Disney essentially lost a lot of their credibility when concerning Star Wars and their treatment of the property. This is why The Rise of Skywalker was so important, and an important movie for me personally, as I did not like, admittedly, a lot of the changes of The Last Jedi, and how that movie chose to handle characters such as Luke Skywalker. And while I understand the reasoning behind why Luke was like that, that's still not the Luke that I always admired from my childhood. Very much a taste thing, but my taste nonetheless. So The Rise of Skywalker for me was a very, very important movie. This movie had the chance to get me and others fully back on board with this sequel trilogy, as for some time now, I was beginning to think of these sequel characters as backburners to the more interesting ones in my opinion, like Darth Vader, Luke, and others. And I am proud to say that I very much deeply enjoyed Star Wars Episode 9 The Rise of Skywalker. However, I realized it's a deeply flawed movie. My greatest issue with The Rise of Skywalker was not any of the characters in particular, but rather the breakneck pacing of this film, as I think the first act or two acts of the movie are paced very, very quickly, needlessly. As for me, it felt as if they were almost trying to go back in time and write their own Episode 8 and have Episode 8 and 9 be one film. I was, however, mostly satisfied by the conclusion of the movie, and I felt a lot of the stuff that happened was actually earned. With all of that said, that's about as far as I can get as far as a spoiler-free review, so there will be spoilers for The Rise of Skywalker from this point on. And I'll talk about some of the major story details that I really liked. As far as stuff that I really enjoyed in The Rise of Skywalker, talking about spoilers, was pretty much all of the returning characters. I thought that the Leia scenes were handled very appropriately despite Carrie Fisher's passing. And although it is one of my deepest regrets that Luke Skywalker is not featured more prominently in the sequel trilogy, I was ultimately satisfied with what we got. However, out of Han, Leia, and Luke, I feel like Luke was really pushed to the back burner in the sequel trilogy. Again, something that I didn't really appreciate as a hardcore Luke Skywalker fan, as he's probably my favorite character of the entire franchise. I realize fully that Luke Skywalker is not the main protagonist of this new sequel trilogy, but I would still have loved to see the Jedi Master in a larger role. A sentiment I know tons of other Star Wars fans share with me. As far as other returning characters though, such as Lando, and again how Leia was handled, I liked it a great deal, and Lando's introduction didn't feel forced at all, surprisingly. I also really liked the stuff with Rey and Kylo Ren in this movie, and how their connection was very clear, as well as Rey's darker nature coming to fruition, even though I felt a lot of the hints that she was in fact a Palpatine were very on the nose and not earned by prior movies. That was, however, my favorite of all of the theories that I crafted, and I do love the idea that Rey is now a Palpatine, and how that accounts for a lot of her abilities and power in the Force, and in this movie, the dark side of the Force specifically. I also really want to touch upon one of the major complaints for The Rise of Skywalker, that being the near endless fan service. As again, a fan that has dedicated the last several years of his life to this franchise, the fan service did not bother me in the slightest. I realize though that is likely simply just for me and my taste in Star Wars, and I could see how it would get annoying by those that don't love the franchise quite as much as I do. I also felt like a lot of the acting in The Rise of Skywalker was very good, and I love the idea that our main trio, Finn, Rey, and Poe, didn't really get along all of the time. Something I also recall liking about the original trilogy, that Han, Luke, and Leia didn't always get along or agree on how certain situations should be handled. As far as the plot for The Rise of Skywalker, it did very much feel like a video game, and it felt like various MacGuffins were pushing along the plot rather than the character development. However, I also want to make it clear that I feel like the second half of the movie is far better at this, and a better movie overall than the first half. I also really enjoyed all the lore building that this movie did. Even though I don't agree with all of it personally, I do like the attempt to actually further the universe, something that I felt like was lacking from The Last Jedi and even somewhat in The Force Awakens. This is absolutely a lore junkies movie. As I mentioned earlier, I was really happy with the reveal that Rey was a Palpatine. I was, however, by the same token, very disappointed pointed at the handling of the Knights of Ren. In the Rise of Kylo Ren comic book series, and even from the visual guide of the Rise of Skywalker, we have so much fun, interesting information on the Knights of Ren that is not capitalized on at all. A huge detriment to those characters, who again, if I feel like they had been established in Star Wars Episode 8, would be largely impactful in 9. Same goes with the backstory of a character like Snoke, as although I do not hate Snoke's backstory, I mostly got it from the Rise of Skywalker visual guide, and was able to put pieces together through that book rather than the Rise of Skywalker itself, as Snoke is only even really referenced in a single line, where Palpatine basically says, "I've been behind the whole thing," something that obviously was not the plan from the get-go. Now on to the part of the Rise of Skywalker that I was the most excited for by far, Darth Sidious, Emperor Palpatine. And I will say this for Palpatine, I was not a fan on how he entered the movie or how he exited the movie, but everything in between and the lore building of the Sith and Sidious I absolutely loved. It feels almost cheap in the beginning that Emperor Palpatine arrives in the story by essentially the title crawl, and we don't actually get to see the discovery of Kylo Ren that Palpatine is around. Palpatine just simply announces it to the galaxy. I'm also not a fan at how Rey simply projects the lightning back at Darth Sidious, and this is what ultimately kills him. I feel as if the Emperor deserved far better than what he got here, even though the explanation for how he died does make sense. It feels somewhat anticlimactic to be the culmination of this whole sequel trilogy, and the realization of Rey's identity for the enemy to be defeated just like that, especially after just barely showing how superior he was to both Rey and Kylo. Again, I understand why it is the way it is, but I don't like the way it was handled. All the stuff in between though was awesome, and I love the design of Darth Sidious, from his old decrepit state to the Sidious that we know from Revenge of the Sith. He looked absolutely terrifying in both forms, and I love the performance by Ian McDiarmid. The Emperor isn't in the movie too much, but what is in the movie is super special. I thought I would be freaked out by this mechanical arm that moves Darth Sidious around, but I love the lore that it adds, and how Sidious is clearly extremely damaged, but at the same time massively powerful. As in my theater, there was utter shock when he shot Force Lightning up into the air and disabled the entire Resistance fleet. One of my favorite shots in all of Star Wars. Now let's briefly talk about Ben Solo's redemption. I thought this was one of the best handled parts of the movie as well. I totally bought that Leia's last words would be Ben, and that this would be the moment that would finally turn Kylo Ren. He tells Rey in the throne room that she cannot go back to Leia, just like he can. And the scene where Han Solo and Kylo Ren were together again brought tears to my eyes. I was surprised how legitimately invested I was in the redemption of Ben Solo, as I went into the movie thinking that I wouldn't be. But I was won over completely by Kylo Ren's turn, and I bought it fully. I love the relationship that Ben Solo and Rey eventually have with one another, and how they both ultimately decide to be good despite their heritage. The moment where Kylo Ren finally defeats Rey was also satisfying, and showed that yes, Kylo Ren has had more training than Rey has, even though they're essentially equals in the Force. The moment where Rey also stabs Kylo Ren was massive, and I loved her decision to run off to Ahch-To after healing him, where Luke Skywalker would eventually appear to her. Again, another one of my favorite scenes in the movie, as it felt like Luke Skywalker was really there, and acting like Luke Skywalker would. I really wanted to see more of Ben Solo after he turned to the light side of the Force, and have him put more above battle with the Knights of Ren and Palpatine, but again, I was satisfied with what I got. And finally, the last thing that I want to touch upon in The Rise of Skywalker is I feel a massive missed opportunity. It's not my job to go back and rewrite Star Wars, and I really shouldn't, but I think Anakin Skywalker's Force Ghost should have been in the movie. And while I think his voice is awesome to hear along with the other Jedi, it's not enough for the Skywalker saga in my opinion. And if Anakin's Force Ghost would have appeared, this movie would have instantly gone up in the rankings, because let's face it, I love Star Wars, and that's what I wanted. I wanted this to feel like the definitive end, not simply the end of the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, but the entirety of the Skywalker saga. saga. In the end though, I will say this about The Rise of Skywalker. It is the ultimate Star Wars movie, and I had an absolutely phenomenal time watching it. I thought there were some missed opportunities and some problems with pacing, but in the end, I really truly enjoyed it, and I feel like I have a similar relationship with this movie that I do Revenge of the Sith or even Return of the Jedi to some extent. There are choices in both of those movies that I do not like as a Star Wars fan, but there's stuff in those movies that I absolutely love as a Star Wars fan, and are some of my favorite parts of the lore and storytelling in the mythos and in a galaxy far, far away. I have no idea where I put The Rise of Skywalker in my rankings, but I feel like it fits in the upper middle echelon of Star Wars films. It is not my favorite by any stretch, and it is not my least favorite by any stretch. This is a good Star Wars movie, and best of all, a good Star Wars movie for Star Wars fans. It is not a great Star Wars movie though. Keep in mind guys, I am not a professional film critic, far from it. I'm just a guy that loves a galaxy far, far away. But now that I've given my review for The Rise of Skywalker, what are your guys' thoughts on episode 9? I will be back to discuss this movie at length in about an hour-long discussion video that I have planned with my friend. So stay tuned for that, and we'll be breaking down The Rise of Skywalker, again more in detail, the stuff that we loved, the lore, and far more, so stay tuned. Anyway guys, thank you so much for coming with me on this journey. May the Force be with you, and have a great day.